I've written an article recently, and I want to bring in my friend David Closson from the Center for Biblical Worldview to continue breaking this down. We're going to talk about your brain on critical theory. David, welcome to the show.
Happy Friday. Good to see you, Joseph.
Happy Friday to you. We just had a great conversation with John. That guy is so enthusiastic. Love everything about him. But and he even brought up this Hamas-Israel connection to critical theory. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we say it all the time that ideas have consequences, Joseph, and I'm sure everyone in the world has been following what's happened in Israel since October the 7th. You know, that's a date that's going to live in infamy in Israel, right along with June 1967, October 1973, other famous wars that have happened in that country. But I don't think what most of us were prepared for was the appalling response from many in the West, particularly college students on elite university campuses. And the way I look at it, Joseph, I think your article helps us kind of sift through this, is that ideas have consequences. And for generations on our elite college campuses, we've been teaching young people to look at the world through the worldview of critical theory, through the worldview of intersectionality, that fundamentally sees the world through the lens of oppressor and oppressed. And part of that also is this ideology of settler colonialism, this idea, and we don't have time to unpack it, but this idea that the Jews, the Israelis, somehow don't actually have a moral claim to their land. And because of that, their enemies, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or whoever it is, can use any means whatsoever to evict them from the land. And so, again, ideas have consequences. And my goodness, bad ideas can have sinister consequences.
Yeah, and I think this idea here that your brain on critical theory, we saw this in the U.S. in the summer of love of 2020, where we saw people rioting and looting and destroying their neighbors' businesses. And infamously, I think it was CNN or MSNBC, one of those two, threw up this headline. There was a burning building behind them, and the headline was, "These are mostly peaceful protests." And everybody chuckled and laughed because this was a strange characterization of obvious rioting happening right behind them. What was even the instinct to describe these crimes as mostly peaceful protests really came from this critical theory. And you mentioned the categories of the oppressors and the oppressed. And I think one of the things that kind of came that was not noticed, that was more subtle while we defined people and categorized them based on their skin color, is that we were also changing the moral framework that we use to determine what is right and wrong. Because in the summer of love of 2020, we were essentially saying, well, we need to listen to the criminals. They're actually the oppressed. Therefore, they have things to say, and their behavior by virtue of being the oppressed may need to be understood more than it needs to be stopped, when the same behavior by those categorized as the oppressors would be something we'd be outraged by, and the law enforcement would be immediately called and people would be arrested. And we, of course, were concerned about that when it was rioting and looting and largely the destruction of property. But I think what we've seen as that same logic has been applied in Israel is that we have now turned a corner into a place where we are kind of excusing, justifying, trying to understand mass rape, mass murder, putting babies in ovens, because the people who are doing it have been identified as the oppressed, and the targets of their violence are those identified as the oppressors. So they say that this is okay.
No, that's right, Joseph. And this is kind of a juxtaposition of putting together consequentialist ethics with these intersectionality categories. You know, intersectionality, men are always oppressing women. White people are always oppressing black and brown people. Straight people are oppressing gay people. Those who own their property are oppressing renters. With this consequentialist ideology that the means justifies the ends. And again, with this settler colonialism, this idea that the Jews, the Israelis, are somehow usurpers of the land rights. And of course, this is a complicated issue. But if you allow that framework to guide the way you do ethics, Joseph, then all of these horrifying means that you just outlined, well, they're justified because guess what? They're directed against the oppressor. And again, this is a gangrene cancer that unfortunately we've now seen has been inculcated in a lot of college campuses. And my goodness, this is dangerous, but thankfully it's being exposed in this conversation.
Well, David, we see that this idea has metastasized and it has sunk deep in many places. What's the response for Western culture and the church?
Yeah, I think as Christians, we know ultimately the gospel, the meta-narratives of Scripture, the meta-narrative of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. The biblical worldview allows us to see things as they are. Christians are the ones that believe in objective truth. It doesn't matter your skin color. It doesn't matter who you're married to. It doesn't matter all these superficial categories. What matters is there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. And so a return to understanding objective truth, objective morality, which again is a byproduct of a Christian worldview. That's something we need to hold on to. That's something the church needs to insist on.
Yeah. And one of the most countercultural Christian doctrines in today's world is the idea that even when you are legitimately a victim, you cannot do whatever you want. We must bless those who curse us, pray for those who spitefully use us. And of course, a big reason for that is the fact that Jesus was the greatest victim of all, yet still laid down his life for us. We're out of time. David, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Joseph.